Hi, I'm Lynn Blend. I'm a drag queen, a Vtuber, and a true crime enthusiast, and on this channel I do videos about historical true crime and mysteries. Today we're going to get into the mystery of one of LA's most famous unsolved murders, the murder of Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia. This is going to be the first of two videos on this case. I was writing this script and it got like really beefy really fast. So the first part we're going to be going into a deep dive on the background of Elizabeth Short, as well as the media attention surrounding this case. And in the next video, I'm going to be looking into theories and suspects for the case, and even looking into and possibly debunking some conspiracy theories. Before we get into the case, I do just want to pop in and say thanks so much to everyone for sticking with me while I've been away. The end of last year was really rough, to say the least. So I'm really grateful to everybody for supporting me through it, and hopefully I'll be able to make more videos very soon. As always, before I get started, I want to get into some content warnings for this case. This video will contain discussions of suicide, violence against women, and sexual assault, so please use your discretion and prioritize your mental health above all else. Elizabeth Short, who would come to be known posthumously as the Black Dahlia, was born on July 29th, 1924 in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Fun fact, in researching this video, I learned that her and I are birthday twins. Which isn't that important, but make of that information what you will. She was the third of 5 children born to Cleo and Phoebe Short. Her father, Cleo Short, had a job building mini golf courses, but after the stock market crashed in 1929, he lost this job, and the family's financial security took a turn for the worse. Cleo mysteriously disappeared when Elizabeth was just 5 years old, and for a long time it was assumed that he had committed suicide since his car was found abandoned near a bridge. But bizarrely, years later, he contacted the family to let them know that he was actually still alive and that he had run out on them and moved to California. In 1939, when Elizabeth was 15 years old, she had lung surgery due to her chronic bronchitis and asthma attacks. She continued to struggle with her respiratory health throughout her life, and to cope with this, she would spend her winters in Florida working as a waitress. In her childhood, she gained an interest in movies, and as a teen, she decided that she wanted to become an actress. So in 1942, at the age of 18, Elizabeth left home and moved to California to pursue her dreams. She initially moved in with her father in California, but they didn't have a good relationship and they often argued. So this culminated in her moving out on her own in 1943 when she was 19. She got a job as a civilian retail clerk in the Army base at Camp Cook, and things seemed to be going well for her here until later that same year she was arrested for underage drinking in Santa Barbara. Even though she was technically an adult, she was judged as a juvenile delinquent, so she was sent back to her mother's home in Medford, Massachusetts. The drinking didn't seem to become a pattern for her later, though. Later, friends would report that after this time she was never really known to drink. In the winter of 1943, Elizabeth went back to her waitressing job in Miami Beach, and the next year she met Air Force Major Matthew Gordon there. The two of them started a relationship and soon became engaged, but tragedy would strike in August of 1945 when Elizabeth's fiancé was killed in a plane crash. The next year, in 1946, Elizabeth decided to give LA another shot. She moved in with an old boyfriend in the city, but he soon moved away, and Elizabeth was left without a permanent place to stay. Throughout the rest of the year, she would bounce around to different hotels and friends' homes in the area. She was known to frequent bars in the area in the hopes of finding men to buy her a meal or offer her a place to stay. She would tell friends that she was an aspiring actress, but during this time, Elizabeth never went to any auditions. She was entirely focused on her survival, and her survival depended on not appearing to be homeless. But sadly, it was probably the fact that she was homeless and bouncing around a lot of different places with people she didn't know that well that left her more vulnerable to what would happen to her in January of 1947. Even all these years later, we don't know all the details of Elizabeth's murder, but we have a pretty good account of what she did in her last days. In late 1946, Elizabeth met a man named Mark Hansen. Remember that name for later. Hansen was the owner of the Florentine Club in Los Angeles. He was in his 50s at the time he knew Elizabeth, who was 22 at this time. It was reported that he would often invite young, attractive women to his home or give them jobs in his club, and Elizabeth ended up living with him during October and November of 1946. He gave her an address book with his name on the front, which would later become an important piece of evidence in her murder case. About a month before her death, in December of 1946, Elizabeth moved to San Diego. Several days after she arrived, she was found sleeping in an evening show in the Aztec Theater by an employee, Dorothy French. Dorothy felt bad for Elizabeth and offered her a place to stay with her family. So she lived with the French family for about a month, but the situation was kind of tense because the family thought she wasn't contributing enough to the household. She didn't have any income coming in. She was described as scared and jumpy, which, honestly, considering, is very understandable. But because of this, the French family told her she had to leave the home on January 8th, 1947, and so she left with a man she met at a bar. This man's name was Red Manley. Also remember this name for later. Manley was married with a newborn, and what he wanted from Elizabeth was for her to help him make the decision to leave his wife and child. If anything sexual happened with Elizabeth, he said he'd leave his wife for her. If not, he would stay. Manley reported that nothing sexual happened between him and Elizabeth. She asked Manley to drive her back to LA, and he did, but after this, he seemed reluctant to leave Elizabeth alone. Elizabeth asked him to drop her off at the bus depot, but once they got there, he protested dropping her off in a bad neighborhood, so she stayed with him. She ended up having to lie to get rid of him. Elizabeth told Manley that her sister had sent her a telegraph asking her to meet up at the Biltmore Hotel. Manley drove her to the Biltmore, but even still, he was reluctant to leave. Manley and Elizabeth stayed in the lounge of the Biltmore Hotel for about 2 hours until Manley finally left. Later that same day, the hotel staff reported seeing her leave the hotel and walk towards the Crown Grill, a spot where she was commonly known to go. This is the last time she was seen alive. 8 days later, on January 17th, 1947, at 10 a.m., Betty Bersinger and her toddler were out for a walk when they came across Elizabeth's body in an empty lot on Norton Avenue. The body had been drained of blood and looked so white that Betty first thought she was looking at a mannequin. When she realized that it was a human body, she immediately called the police. It's not known exactly what happened to Elizabeth in the 7 days between the last time she was seen by the Biltmore Hotel staff and when her body was found in the empty lot, but one thing was certain based on the condition of her body. Whoever killed her had held her captive and tortured her for days. There were ligature marks around her wrists and ankles indicating that she'd been tied up, signs of possible sexual assault, cuts across her arms and chest, and bruises indicating that she'd been bludgeoned in the head. Her body was found completely drained of blood and precisely cut in two at the torso, and her face was carved into what's called a Glasgow smile, with deep cuts extending the edges of her mouth upward. Her tattoo and part of her breast had been removed, and police later found the skin from her tattoo inside her vaginal cavity. Some of this might have even been done while she was alive, because her cause of death was ruled to be blood loss. Wherever she was killed, it was not in the empty lot where she was found. There was no blood found at the crime scene, and the body had been scrubbed clean before it was moved there. As a side note, I've said it before in my videos, and I'll say it here again. Since the photos of Elizabeth Short's body are perhaps the most famous crime scene photos in history, I figured it was appropriate to mention that I will never show photos of the bodies of murder victims on this channel. I will only ever show pictures of them while they were alive, I will go a bit more in depth on this later in the video, but I just think it's so weird how much of the legacy of this case is tied up in that famous photograph of Elizabeth Short's corpse, and how weirdly celebrated and commodified that photo has become. My goal in this video is to learn and share more about her life and try my best to understand what happened to her and why, even though there's no definitive answers. Once Elizabeth's body was discovered, the investigation began. The first moves police made were to try to identify the body. Police took her fingerprints and sent them over to the FBI, and they were able to match the fingerprints to Elizabeth from her arrest records for her underage drinking charge back from when she was 19. From there, they contacted Elizabeth's mother, and this next part seems really cruel to me, but they got her mother Phoebe out to California by lying to her and telling her that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest. Once the police got her mother out there under these false pretenses, she went to the morgue to identify Elizabeth's body. Elizabeth's father, Cleo, who I mentioned earlier, lived nearby in California. He both refused to come to the morgue to identify Elizabeth's body and refused to attend her funeral. One of the reasons Elizabeth Short's murder case is so well known is because there was so much media coverage at the time. The fact that Elizabeth was a young woman, killed in such a gruesome way, attracted a lot of media attention. It's not entirely certain, though, how she came to be known as Black Dahlia in the papers. There are a lot of conflicting reports about this. Some say that the nickname was invented by the papers, and some say that this was a nickname people used for her when she was alive. Some say that it was because she was known to wear dahlias in her hair and had black hair and black clothes. Some say it's a play on the movie The Blue Dahlia, which had come out the previous year and was popular at the time, but it's not exactly known where the name came from. The papers at the time took it and ran with it, though, and to this day Elizabeth Short is most famously known as the Black Dahlia. Some of the biggest pieces of evidence referenced in this case were found later in the month. On January 24th, 1947, a package arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner. A note in the package was constructed of cut-out letters from magazines and read, "Here's Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." The package contained some of Elizabeth's personal effects, like her social security card, birth certificate, photos, a newspaper clipping about her late fiancé, Matthew Gordon, and the address book that was given to her by Mark Hansen. Remember him from earlier? Some of the pages in the address book were torn out, but it's unknown if those pages were torn out before or after the book was given to Elizabeth. If it was after, they could have been torn out to hide the identity of the killer. All of the items in the package had been soaked in gasoline to remove any fingerprints. It is thought that this package came from Elizabeth's killer, though the same can't be said for many of the letters that the police and the newspapers received after this. There were several letters that arrived later from someone calling themselves the Black Dahlia Avenger. These letters didn't contain any more of Elizabeth's belongings, however, so these ones are thought to be a hoax. The day after the original package was received, on January 25th, 1947, police found Elizabeth's purse and one of her shoes in a dumpster close to the site where the body was found. The purse and her shoe were identified as Elizabeth's by Red Manley. There's Red Manley showing up again. Definitely keep both of those names in mind for my next video up on this case, where I'll be talking about suspects and theories for what really happened to Elizabeth. But for now, I want to get into one of the things that I think is just really strange and weird and kind of gross about this case, which is how it's remembered today. I did touch briefly on this earlier in the video, but I just think it's so weird how Elizabeth Short's murder has been remembered in a way where it's glamorized or even seen as a positive for her. It's really gross to me how the photo of her body is not only readily available, but it's the photo that's most associated with her. It's like the second or third result on Google Images when you Google her. There's kind of like a fandom for this murder, like not even for her as a person, like her murder. Like, you can get t-shirts with that picture of her body on them. That's just so, like, weird and gross to me. Quite possibly the worst take on this case, in my opinion, that I have ever seen is that Elizabeth's murder was somehow a positive for her, or that she got what she wanted because she's famous now. She did not deserve to be tortured and murdered. Like, I can't believe that I have to say this. Like, that was not her goal and her dream in life. She wanted to be an actress. She didn't want to be murdered. In the last few years of her life, she wasn't even really focusing on that goal. Her biggest focus was staying alive, and that's something she fought for as long as she could. But unfortunately, she was a young, attractive woman and homeless and had to rely on strangers in order to survive. And in the end, somebody took advantage of that. I understand that when terrible, unexplainable things happen, sometimes people want to try to come up with some kind of silver lining, but in my opinion, believing that Elizabeth Short got what she wanted because her murder is so famous is just so ghoulish, and it's not the silver lining people seem to think it is. Thanks so much for joining me for a deep dive into the background of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. I will be getting on to part 2 of this video, where I talk about suspects and theories very shortly, but coming up next I will have a video on my experience playing the psychological horror visual novel To Be With You, as well as a video looking into some alien abduction stories from the 1950s, so look out for those. Huge thanks to my Ko-Fi supporters Lotus, Ruby, Salika, and Smallzy. Thank you all so much. You can see all of my videos early and suggest topics by supporting me at ko-fi.com/spinnblend. Thanks so much for watching.